It's about 4 a.m. if I can't get through. You're making my heart wonder, I wonder if it's true. The love I hear in you at times, I feel lost. So what would you do if I said, so no more time spent on you, what would you do? So no more time spent on you, what would you do if I said, so no more time spent on you, what if I did it, I told you no more time, no more time, no more time, no more time. You no more time, no more time, no more time, no more time. I told you no more time. Oh, this time I was loving you. Took my energy when you didn't plan to stay through. Only here when the good times are around. So today I say that the priority, I'm saying no more time. Oh yeah. I'm telling you no more time. I'm telling you no more time. So that's it. No more time. So much pain. Been in and out of these things. Trying so hard. We both felt the same. The on-ramps were different, but it's fine. I'ma take care of me. Cause I'm not myself when I'm around you. I need to know who I am without you. I need to know what it means to just be me. And I'm not myself when I'm around you. I need to know I want you. Oh yeah, yeah. Cause I'm not myself when I ain't around you, around you, around you, around you.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's your boy Jay Connor, one half of the Extraordinary Negroes and staff writer over at The Root. Welcome to our conversation, Building Allegiance with Black Men. We're thankful to have you join us for the fourth conversation of our 5-part digital conversation series focused on how Black men can better show up for Black survivors. Over the past few months, we as ourselves has held space for much needed dialogue about the power of Black survivors to tell their stories, exploring models of care, healing, accountability, and ways we shift the cultural conversation. We want to thank Lunch Table for sponsoring this series and stay tuned for our final conversations by creating an account to RSVP on lunchtable.com, Blavity's streaming and networking platform. We invite you to join us in this important work by using and following the hashtag We As Ourselves to continue the conversation. You can text Love Letter to 30644 to take the pledge to show love for those who have been shut out, silenced, and scrutinized. And you should also follow all three of our partner organizations on Twitter, which is at NWLC, at Me Too Movement, that's Me Too MBMT, and at Time's Up Now. We as ourselves acknowledge our tremendous responsibility to the care and well-being of our audiences and prioritizes the need of our communities of survivors first. We want to hold a space together, and that means upholding agreements of respect, active listening, and compassion, not judgment. We also have resources on the We As Ourselves website as weasourselves.org. Today's discussion will center on the role that Black men and masculine folks play in supporting Black survivors, exploring ways to show up for Black women with the vigor that they show up for Black men, creating an open dialogue about how we hold each other accountable, and the next steps that we can take collectively to disrupting rape culture and toxic masculinity within our communities. I have the pleasure of introducing three dynamic leaders in the fight for gender equality and justice to discuss how we can better show up for survivors during every step of them sharing their stories, pushing back on harmful narratives that undermine survivors when they come forward, and ensuring that Black survivor stories are amplified, heard, and most importantly, believed. Today, we're joined by Preston Mitchum, Director of Policy at URGE, Unite for Reproductive and Gender Equity, Black Queer Advocate. We have Emanuel H. Brown, a Black trans masculine non-binary steward and Executive Director of Acorn Center for Restoration and Freedom, curator and cultural organizer. And we have Phil Agnew, nationally recognized educator, strategist, trainer, speaker, and cultural critic, and co-founder of Spoke Signals Studio. Now, looking at the last year with the black boxes that we've seen on social media and corporations pledging millions that still have yet to materialize, the term allyship can feel more like a trendy performative label, when instead it should be about the actual work that we're all doing. As we begin this conversation about building allegiances with Black women to end sexual violence, we have Phil, who's representing a cisgender straight man. Why is it crucial for you to stand with and protect Black women, both cis and trans, beyond a hashtag? And what does that look like?
Well, first, I want to thank everybody that had a hand in putting this conversation and the series together. It's it is a burden and an honor to be here, speaking on behalf of not just myself, but another organization that I co-founded, Black Men Build, which seeks to organize and transform Black men. I think that's the hat that I'm wearing today. It's important. The way I think about it is quite simple. None of us are free until all of us are free. If Black women, if Black trans women are fighting multiple wars, one of those wars should not be against Black men. Black men should not be on the other side of this battle. When I think about allyship, I really actually hate the term. I don't use the term at all. I don't call white people allies. I like to use the word solidarity. And the original meaning of solidarity is that means you're taking on the burden with. That means the burden that you have on your shoulders, which may be at 100% right now. That means once I step into the fight or anybody else steps into the fight, now it's 50%, 40%, 30%, 20%, 10%, because that burden is now felt on all of our shoulders. This is all of our fight, right? We live in a country that has, for the entirety of its existence, invested in patriarchy, invested in the belief that men have dominion over women and all other things in the world. And that is our fight too, as Black men. So it's important to me because it is central to our liberatory struggle. For men that are watching this, who look up to Huey Newton and look up to other figures, many of them, if not all of them, have authored papers and done presentations and spoken. Maybe they haven't done it best in action, but these brothers have always talked about the necessity of protecting and standing alongside our sisters, our trans family, and that goes back to the history of the Black Panthers and any other org. So if you consider yourself a revolutionary, the fight to protect Black women is absolutely a part of our fight. It is central to our fight because we can't move forward without their leadership, without their partnership. And so for me, I take it personally. It's a fight that I haven't always seen and been a part of consciously. But in the last few years, as I've begun to unravel the different ways that I've become the person that I didn't want to be, or a person that I am not happy with, it has risen to prominence in the last year, especially with Black Men Build, the necessity of Black men, cisgender Black men in specific, to talk to our brothers, not just in public on Zooms, but really in the car, really on the couch, really in your living room about these key things. And I'll just say this, I'm also a part of a fraternity. And so it's really the duty of all men, I think, especially men who find themselves in other fraternal and kind of male-based organizations, to do this work behind closed doors, especially.
I couldn't have said it better myself. Emanuel, as a Black trans masculine individual, what does this work look like for you?
Yeah, thank you all so much. And again, thank you to really all of the Black cis and trans women that I know are behind this movement and making this a consistent, visible conversation over these past few years. And for me, I really think about it in three different ways. One, it's about putting those people who are so brave to come out and tell their stories, putting their names in your mouth, right? Talk, just like Phil was saying, talking about them like, oh, did you hear about this latest story of this woman who is coming forward, and talking about it with bravery to be like, woo, I don't know if I could do that. Or, to really be talking about it in the vulnerability, to match the vulnerability of the disclosures that are coming forward, and to making sure that those names are visible in your community, in masculine and male community, that y'all know who those women are who are coming to the forefront. Not just talking about it off the cuff or commentarily, but really engaging the dialogue with vulnerability the way that they are engaging us with the vulnerability of their stories. The second place, because as a member of the queer community, I think that there's a particular thing that Black trans women and Black cis women who are also queer come into the space with an additional layer of homophobia when talking about sexual violence, i.e. that sexual violence, and this is something that's held within the Black community pretty strongly, that sexual violence is the cause of my queerness, right? So it creates this additional barrier, I believe, for queer and trans Black women to come in and really talk and have an open space about sexual violence. So whether they are your friends, your coworkers, your movement comrades, your lovers, your partners, to be able to declare yourself a safe space as a masculine person, within queer community, to say, I am a safe space for your survivorship to be present, right? If that is needed and necessary, if that's something that you desire to have. So that it can really reduce that additional shame of the way that homophobia and transphobia play a role in survivors staying silent within queer community. And then finally, as somebody who is trans masculine, so has lived a designated life as woman and girl, whether that was my identity or not, to create spaces that are really complicated for us to talk about survivorship pre-transition, survivorship after transition, right? And to really talk about, like, what does it mean to have lived a life designated as woman and girl, and the places where my own survivorship has taken shape and form from those identities, right? How do we create safer spaces for trans men, trans masculine folks to be in the really curious place that we find ourselves when we are also survivors?
Yeah, that's what's up. Preston, as a Black cisgender gay man, tell us how this work means to you.
First, thank you to the organizers of this event. What a brilliant panel. Phil and Emanuel, just brilliant. And I appreciate you both. I should say that one quote that really punched me in the gut the other day was that all Black women knows at least one Black woman who has been sexually assaulted, yet Black men don't know any men who's done the sexual assault. And it punched me in my gut because it really made me think through the conversations that many people are not having, because it places such an accountability and burden on the people to feel attacked and defensive when people are just asking to listen, just asking us to be called in, just asking us to be accountable. And as Phil was describing, taking some of the burden off of some people in our community who experience so many margins that we can't even count them. And my feelings of allyship has shifted a lot over the years, but where I've ultimately landed is that allyship is never enough, so I hate it, right? Yeah. I think we should really lean into is things like co-conspiratorship or accomplices, people who are actively willing when they're able to actually place themselves in the way, sometimes physical, of other people, particularly Black women, Black trans folks not being harmed, right? Allyship is easy. It's not to say that it's not important. It's not to say that it's not everyone's start. The problem with allyship is that most people in there. And so what we're actively looking for is people to actively listen, to speak up, to sometimes lose friends and lose relationships because you are so comfortable with making spaces uncomfortable. It's about speaking to Black men around all sexuality spectrums related to the harm that we're actively causing. And the truth is, we see it, we know it exists, and many of us are just so afraid to speak about it because they're afraid what that means for them and the relationships they've formed and the power that they've received. This work is really invested, and it's to divest from white supremacist values, even when that shows up in Black skin. And sometimes it really means call attention and our feet to the fire of the way that we've actually benefited from patriarchy, even though it harmed us along the way.
Yeah. No, that's well said. Now, the opposite of doing the work is being complicit and not believing Black women who are survivors of sexual and physical violence. Sadly, from the survivors in the doc of On the Record to Megan Thee Stallion, when the perpetrators are beloved Black men, often we see a silence, a disbelief that the accused is capable of this type of violence and or a need to call Black women liars. But let's keep it 100. We all know Bill Cosby wasn't about to buy NBC and Megan Thee Stallion didn't shoot herself. So where do you all believe this knee-jerk reaction to protect Black men stems from? And why do you think it continues to exist? Let's start with Emanuel.
Yeah, my number one answer is grief. I think that there is a deep grief within our Black community about the ways that we have taken on quite literally the master's tools and used them on each other in really intense and harmful ways. So I think when those visibility moments about Black men of stature come forward, our inability to actually access our own mourning and grieving rituals, I think gets toxic, right? And becomes survivor blame and becomes protectionism, right? And for me, what I hope and I desire for Black people is that we can access grief on a more regular basis, so that we can really grapple with the internal things like Preston was just mentioning around like the ways that we actually have used these tools of oppression, of protectionism, of harm, of violence on each other's for generations, right? And the way that we seem to not be able to stop them from happening, to be passed down from generation to generation. That the more that we're able to access our grief around those facts, those are facts. I think we talk about internalized oppression as a theoretical concept, but that's internalized oppression in action. Those are facts. The more that we can grapple with the grief of that, the more that we will be able to respond with grief when we hear about these, instead of outrage, instead of protectionism, instead of clinging on to tools that are literally dividing us and killing us from within.
Hallelujah. Phil, what you got?
I don't know. I think it's answered to save time, but I'd say I think there are a few things that gives us that knee-jerk reaction. I think it's more than a knee-jerk, right? It's a generational knee-jerk. It's the history of Black men being falsely accused. Right. And so Black people cling to that history. This Black man who was trying to do something with his life. We've seen years and years of white women and other women trying to tear him down. So they cling to that very true narrative to perpetuate falsehoods. Right. There's patriarchy that says that men, as I said before, that masculine people have dominion over the world, and that the woman's body, in particular, the Black woman's body, is a plaything. And so, if it did happen, she did something. She was wearing this. She was trying to get in the bag. And then the third thing is bullshit, right? All of it is bullshit. But it's if we are going to believe that Tory and Bill did this, then maybe somebody will start looking at me and what I did in the frat or what I did in college. And this is a slippery slope, brothers, that if we're going to start going at him for doing this with the champagne, what about the alpha juice? What about this? What about that? And I keep going back to the frat because I just had a great weekend with some frat brothers and we started to untangle this stuff. But it's a combination of all three of those. They're all bullshit, but I think all of them do factor in. Some of them truths, half truths, some of them, prejudices from before, and it all winds up here. And I think where it lands once again is that Black women become discarded. They become discardable. And so this country, once again, if we are going to be revolutionary brothers, sisters, people of all identities, then we have to untangle the different ways in which the colonial mind has taught us. And one of those is primary. We cannot continue to live in a world where we immediately believe the men and do not believe the people who are doing the accusing. And I think it requires of us a whole bunch of soul searching and looking in the mirror, because at the end of the day, no matter which of those three reasons that I tried to present there, I think at the end of the day, most people, in particular men, but all the people who rush to the defense of these famous men are really scared to look at the ways in which their family, themselves, as Emanuel was saying, as everyone has said, are complicit in this. And so in the little and the small ways. And before I talked about in private, but I do think for cisgender men in public, to evolve in public as well, and come out as believers early and often, it's just super, super important as well.
Yeah, for sure. Preston, what you got?
And many Black men, unfortunately, see justice as getting away with crimes that white men got away with. So so in 2019, I remember distinctly writing an article after Surviving R. Kelly came out. And it was clear to me that instead of critiquing this pervasive rape culture that we as Black men have perpetuated and the acts of violence, obviously, that we've perpetuated onto people, what a lot of people's comments were about, well, why are we not talking about these white men? We're like, all of y'all are actively guilty, frankly, whatever eyes of whatever law we're looking at, right? Certainly in my eyes, are sexual assault perpetrators and abusers and harm doers, et cetera. But many wanted to get away with it. Many wanted the Black men with power and clout. Even many of the Black men who actively were anti-Black to get away with some of the same things that they saw white men get away with. And so I want to be clear by stating, as a Black queer man, one thing that I realize is that my manhood is immediately diminished. That is true sometimes, even in my fraternity, 06 frat. And in my experience, many straight Black men in particular have already relegated me to womanhood because of the project, right? How that impacts queer people too. Mm-hmm. So that doesn't bother me because I'm not attached to manhood. And to be clear, that's not to say that I understand what Black women feel. And it is to explain that many of us are experiencing patriarchal violence. I think back to the initial question, especially of how livid I was around people's treatment around Megan Thee Stallion. And really when she was really silent about it, right? For a minute until Tory and his people said something. And so that also broke my heart because what that meant was that silence was rooted in protection of Black men, even those who've done Black women harm. And so, ironically enough, the week before that incident happened, I had made a thread explaining why Black men incorrectly believe that we're the most oppressed, right? Part of it is because we ignore our own patriarchal violence, and other parts is because we don't even take Black women into consideration at all. And so then I remember, that is so many Black women's story, right? So when I think about co-conspiratorship and accompliceship and this entire conversation, frankly, I think around the silence that so many people have just so people won't hate Black men, right? Mm-hmm. The Black man who's done so much harm, right? And then I think, can you imagine what it feels like to keep a violent situation private just so other people won't believe something about you just because society said it was true, right? Can you imagine being silent about the harm that you're experiencing just for someone else's protection, right? I think the knee-jerk reaction is rooted in protection, and it's rooted in the worst kind of protection because it's of the very people who do not care about you being protected.
Yeah. No, that's what's up. So in regards to solidarity, there's a lot of Black men who obviously want to stand in solidarity, but what are the obstacles that they face in speaking out and choosing to side with women publicly, Black women specifically? Phil, what are your thoughts on that?
I'll try to be quick, right? It's public and private scrutiny, right? You're immediately ostracized. Nobody wants to invite you to the kickback because we can't really do what we want to do at the kickback because we got the police here, and so I think those are the main obstacles. We live in a culture. That culture is reinforced in big and in small ways, interpersonally and structurally. And so when you become a part of the counterculture, the culture wants to expel you. And so, and I haven't even talked about what the internet does to you, right? Or those corners of the internet when you come out in support of somebody or come in support of a survivor, not somebody, let's be specific, in support of a survivor. And so I think those are the major obstacles. Feeling as I'm looking at a book right now called Black Male Outsider, incredible book I highly recommend for folks, but that's what you become. You become an outsider. If you come from my background and we all come from different ones, you long to want to become. You don't want to be outside of the Black male culture that you were either raised in or at least raised to look up to. And so I think those are a lot of the primary obstacles. And then, we've seen some extreme cases where people have lost positions and roles, et cetera, because you're not one of the boys anymore. You're not one of the guys anymore. And so I think, brothers, we have a duty right now, and the moment is calling for us to transform and to change. And I am seeing little tears in that, what seemed like a fabric that couldn't be broken. I'm a part of witnessing and maybe tearing in some ways on my best days, through some of that and building a new culture. But that's what you face, man. People don't want to be around you. Because you can't do what you used to doing.
Right. And Preston, what else is working to change this, and what more do you feel that we can do?
There's tons that we can do. My personal fight and where I would like to see Black men invest their time and energy to is to reproductive justice work. It's amazing just how few men generally are in these spaces. And, reproduction doesn't just exist in a vacuum, right? And so I think when we're talking around like queer and trans people's experiences, right, that's also rooted in reproduction, right? And we're thinking of the term reproductive justice. I believe this should really show up in this way, right? It's coined in 94 by 12 Black women who recognized that white women were not talking about their issues, right? They were talking about issues that were important and that impacted them for sure, like abortion access, sex ed, among others. But they were just like, where are the police violence conversations happening, right? Where's the environmental justice conversation happening? What about like birth workers and doula care, et cetera? And so they coined this term in 4 tenets: the right to have a child, to not have a child, to raise the children we have in safe environments, and the right to bodily autonomy. And so I think where we could really start investing a lot of our time and energy is around reproductive justice work, because it's deeply rooted in or deeply rooted away from white supremacist norms and state and interpersonal violence, and actively being in solidarity with communities that we are a part of, right? Because when we think about safety of young people, right, and you're thinking about becoming pregnant or bearing a child, who may want to raise a child if they know their child can be shot by the police, right? Like if you are a trans person and actively, and everyone talks about like women's rights issues, and you're like, I don't identify as a woman and I'm capable of becoming pregnant, then where do you fit into the conversation? And so for me, this is where this is the role of masculinity, right? Patriarchy doesn't even give us a chance to have these conversations, right? We're unlearning things every day. I myself am often reflecting on what masculinity means, who owns it, what it means, who has space to it, who actively rejects it, and why. And so that's the thing that I think is really important. And that is the work that we can start to do a bit more of.
Yeah, for sure. Another aspect of being an ally is to respect a Black woman's right to say no, to honor their autonomy and their bodies, and to reject the ideas that sexual violence is a rite of passage for Black women and girls. But how do toxic masculinity and the way that Black men generally have been socialized sexually stand in the way of allowing that to happen? We'll start with Emanuel.
Preston began to touch on this a little bit in the reproductive justice conversation, so I'm just going to dig in a little deeper about the body, right? So what patriarchal toxic masculinity immediately does is disconnect us from our bodies. In an embodied way, right? In a way that we are our whole full selves, in our cells, in our skin, in our DNA, in the way that we move and walk through the world. And that's the immediate thing, right? I feel like most cis men and even masculine folks, as a trans person, being cultivated into a culture of masculinity, or of manhood, or trying to take my cues from both of those spaces, I was like, oh, brothers are not in their bodies. They're using them in a particular way, right? Yeah. But there's no identity with oh, my elbow hurts. What does that mean? Let me think about that deeper, right? There's a lot of, what I learned from my father and my brothers was to actively ignore my body, right? As long as I could get up and go to work, I could ignore anything else that it was telling me. That pain in my stomach, I could ignore that. That pain in my hip, knee, I could ignore that. If I was feeling something in my chest. So the disconnection from the body, period, that is inside of patriarchal toxic masculinity makes it almost impossible for men and masculine folks to consider other people's bodies as sacred, as being, as deserving of protection, right? As most certainly not a place to be transgressed, right? So I think the thing, and where I've started my own healing journey, has really been about how do I get reconnected to this body? Sonia Renee Taylor in Body Is Not of Apology talks about this is it, right? No matter what happens, no matter your relationship to this body, no matter what changes you take this body through, you get this one body. So why not honor it, right? And for me, that's the place where I begin around how do we get to a place where we can honor the bodies of women, trans and cis women alike, right? Is by being connected to our own.
Yeah. Phil, how does this silence around Black men who are also sexual assault survivors impact this as well?
Emanuel hit it on the head. A lot of what Emanuel was saying is really resonating with me. I started writing a little bit about not really loving or liking my body, and I think most Black men don't learn that. So I'm marinating on that. I do want to give a coherent answer though. But we're taught to live lives of silence. And excuse me if I keep throwing out, capitalism, white supremacy, patriarchy, colonialism, but the colonial project flourishes in silence and with amnesia, right? It wants us to forget. It forces us to dismember ourselves, because when we remember, when we bring those pieces back together, to live in the way that we are living is unconscionable. And so for me, as a Black man, I learned that manhood, I learned that brotherhood, I learned that community and family, frankly, flourished only if there was silence and secrets. And so you walk it off. That bad thing that happened to you, you keep it moving. You don't let that thing weigh you down. We don't have time for that, right? There are bigger things. There are more important things. Don't put that dirty laundry in the front yard. You handle family business inside the house. All of these things have become part and parcel of the Black experience because of where we live. Let's be clear. And so for me, the silence and the secrets are the biggest obstacles to intimacy, to vulnerability, to healing, and really to freedom, right? And so what happens to Black men, I think I've experienced within our organization, more recent stories have started to slip out and come out. It wasn't accidental. People told them. And the fact that men feel in some ways that they could never utter those things because it takes away still from who they are, their manhood, their masculinity, is a very sad state of affairs. And I think that's our goal as Black men, build to create the container and an organization where Black men can lay down their burdens, right? And stop hurting the people around them and hurting themselves. And that's what that silence does. Silence forces an inward destruction, right? Where you hate yourself, and that bleeds into everybody around you, almost especially the people who dare to love you. And so that's what our work is to defeat the silence, to silence the cynicism and the secrets, right? And to come into the light. And I think that's what this moment is requiring of all of us. And if you all would pardon me, I think cisgender heterosexual men may be the most, right? It is requiring and calling of us to transform to meet this moment, because the ways of Western toxic patriarchal masculinity has done us in for generations and will continue to do so. And it's trying to double down right now. It's trying to double down because it sees that its hold on many of us is slipping.
Yeah, no, that's real. We're running short on time, so I want to ask one final question to everybody. When we stand up for Black women and girls, we send a message to other survivors that they matter. What's one thing that a Black man can do today to care for Black survivors? And second, what can they do to hold another Black man accountable? We'll start with you, Preston.
Yeah, so one, appreciate this conversation so much. And so the reason why this work, I would say, ultimately became easier for me was because I myself am a survivor. And so I started to discuss what it meant to be a survivor, and a survivor who believes in abolition. It was tough. Right. One of the conversations that I see happening more, and I'm thankful for it, is that some of us as survivors do not want to replicate the harm that our harm doers did to us. Right. And so for me, as someone who's always had a complicated relationship with Black men, particularly cis-het Black men, right, from my birth father to the person who abused me, which was my stepfather, the way I had to navigate these spaces were really difficult, and it made me hold on to Black women more because they did not actively do me harm. And so thinking of protection, right? The Black men who were always speaking about strength and protection were some of the biggest abusers I've ever experienced in my life. And again, as I unlearn, I realized that not all Black men are like that, right? I'm not disassociating myself from being a Black man. And so that was complicated for me. So to answer this direct question, I think we can start doing smaller things, right? Checking on our Black women friends, being willing to ask the difficult question, have I harmed you, right? Being willing to accept the answer that you likely have, right? And then defending and believing survivors. It is amazing some of the things you can do and some of the barriers you can break down by just saying believe survivors and actively believing them, right? Amazing when I started to discuss my story of sexual assault, how many Black men actually started to direct message me and tell me that they actually have been assaulted as well and didn't know how to share the story and didn't feel safe and affirmed to do so. And so I think there are multiple things that we can do, but it really starts with actually just naming the thing. We can start from a place of honesty, right? We can't start from a place of harm, but we can start from a place of honesty. Because once we actually talk about the ways we've harmed Black women, we actually allow them to be more safe in telling their stories as well.
Right. Emanuel, what's one thing that a Black man can do today to care for Black survivors? And second, what can they do to hold another Black man accountable? And try to keep it quick so that Phil can make sure he gets into.
Absolutely. The first thing is, just like you ask all kinds of questions in your romantic dating process, please start to ask Black women and trans women, cis and trans women, about if they have experiences of sexual harm. I am shocked every day about how often my friends, my community, other lovers that I've had, partners, have never had those questions asked to them. I think it's the first entryway into this is a conversation that I'm willing to have. And as far as accountability, my thing is move towards, not away. We all like to distance ourselves from the people who are being called out for harm, or that we know in our community do harm. How do we begin as Black men and masculine folks to actually move towards those people, to get curious with them, and to absolutely hold the line that it is harm that they're doing. There is no mince words about that, but I'm doing that with love and brotherly love towards you, because I know that you can do better. And I think if I can support you in your corner, then we can do better together. And to be able to hold that line to say, I'm going to move towards the people who I know do these harmful behaviors versus away and trying to separate myself.
Right. Phil, what's one way that a Black man can do today? What's one thing that a Black man can do today to care for Black survivors? And second, what can they do to hold another Black man accountable? Real quick.
I have a few, I'll be quick. Self-work, go to therapy. Curiosity, ask the questions of your partners, of your sisters, of the people around you, your brothers as well around you, and the accountability is key in the small ways. You have no problem telling your brother when his breath stink or his outfit not tight, embarrassing him in all type of other ways. It's time to embarrass privately, I believe, before the public thing comes on that ass. Is look, bro, we need to talk. And I think a lot of those conversations people are ready to have right now, because it's becoming a burden more and more. And I'm seeing it every single day and talking to brothers. So have those private conversations and evolve in public.
Word. One of the things that I always like to say is that when it comes to matters of gender inequality, in addition to racism, I tell people all the time that Black folks, we cannot be project managers. You know what I'm saying? We have to be consultants. We can't take the lead. And when it comes to matters of gender inequality, we have to address it the same way as Black men. We got to do the work. We got to make sure that we show up for these Black women and that we hold ourselves accountable so that we can continue to do right by them. And hopefully this conversation serves as a springboard and a catalyst and a call to action to get Black men to, handle their business and do what it is that they need to do to make sure that, we correct these wrongs and this patriarchy in our society, as well as this misogynoir. So once again, I'd like to thank Me Too International, the National Women's Law Center, and Time's Up Foundation, and especially Lunch Table for partnering with us on this much needed conversation. Thank you to our panelists for being authentic and helping shift the ways that we can. For those of you who are joining us this evening, it's my hope that you gained valuable insight and were enlightened by this conversation that we just had. We as ourselves as a call to action to center the voices and experiences of Black survivors to be heard and supported. We encourage you to actively listen to survivors, hold each other accountable in supporting them, and use the upcoming conversation guides to further this conversation in your own home with your family, friends, and community. Our final event is Wednesday, August 18th. Please don't miss that out. Don't miss your blessing. And don't forget to text love letter to 30644 so you can learn more and get connected and you can also learn more and get connected at weareourselves.org. To keep in touch on our panelists' work, you can check out PrestonMitchum.com. He recently did an interview on over at USA Today, which you can find on LGBTQ students need inclusive safe sex, but less than 10% in the US are receiving it, according to a report. And you can hit up EmanuelHBrown.com and all the amazing work that he's doing. Also, make sure you check out Black Men Build with Phil. And again, thank you for showing up for us. Thank you for being a part of this conversation. We appreciate it. And we're just getting started. Peace out, y'all.
I'm spent on you. It's about 4 a.m. if I can't get through.